Welcome to Transform, Tomorrow's Thinking Today, your guide to the way groundbreaking innovation and digital transformation are reshaping our world, from cybersecurity in critical infrastructure to generative AI. Divya Saran takes you beyond the buzzwords, direct to their clients and experts on topics dominating the headlines and derailing boardroom discussions.
We are really at a turning point here when it comes to the technology that is available to aid wildfire evacuation planning and in general emergency management, because we have more and more simulation tools that can actually enable predictions of how these kind of threatening scenarios evolve, meaning that we can kind of see the future.
That's Enrico Ronchi, Associate Professor at Lund University in Sweden. Joining Divya and Enrico are GHD's Dan Stockdale from the Movement Strategies team and Transportation Planner Kamryn Kubose-Peutz as they explore how climate change is reshaping emergency response. From the rise of wildfires and the wildland-urban interface to how cutting-edge simulation tools are helping communities plan, adapt and stay safe. The industry is evolving rapidly, and what we're sharing in this conversation reflects experiences that are constantly shifting. It's a reminder of how important it is to stay current and to keep learning. Over to Divya to kick things off.
Welcome back to GHD's Transform podcast. Today's a special topic because we're really diving into climate change and technology, but I actually had a really interesting conversation with my family this morning, and they're like, why are you talking about wildfires when it comes to climate change and technology and evacuation technology? So I thought before we dive into anything technology related, can we talk a bit about wildfires and the industry and the uprise of wildfires and why it's such an important topic in climate change?
I'm Dan Stockdale. I'm a senior advisor and part of the GHD team working within movement strategies. So always looking about how people are moving around spaces and how we can better optimize those systems to improve performances and outcomes. And I guess moving people in a community evacuation during a wildfire or other emergency event is no different. I had that kind of first-hand experience when I moved from the UK to Canada last year, where I was in Jasper, where I was actually one of 20,000 people that were evacuated as part of that, and felt the need for kind of the important planning and the emergency response required to move those number of people in such a short period of time to such an evolving issue. That fire was borne out within 2 hours. It was over 6,000 hectares, which was nearly 6,000 football fields. And then 48 hours later, it was 30,000. So it was growing at a huge rate with 30 to 40 meter high flames and spot fires starting from over half a kilometre away. That was in Alberta, in the national park there, with huge economic damage and impact to the tourism industry. But obviously we saw the impacts of the fires in LA and the monetary value that was impacted from that. So it's something that's only going to get bigger and more important as we plan for that.
Kamryn, do you think, are we at unprecedented times? Like, what are you noticing as also a person that's in this field?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we are experiencing increased frequency and severity of these events. And we're already seeing that. And the research is suggesting on the path that we're heading towards that we're going to continue seeing that. So we really need to be able to adapt and anticipate these events and be prepared as much as possible.
Okay. And I guess, like, who really takes the responsibility of that at the end of the day? Is it the firefighters or the planners? Like, what does industry need to do to actually start planning and tackling for it? And Dan, from your firsthand experience, like, what had happened? Like, was it only firefighters that showed up, or did you see some evacuation routes?
So they had an emergency response and an incident planning team that were deployed, and that's a scalable team that can respond to the issue that's required. So that was a team of emergency responders, council members and community members as well, where they were looking at both tracking and monitoring the fire, but also looking at how and when they were going to evacuate those people from the townscape.
Yeah, exactly. And like Dan is saying, there's so many stakeholders involved and so many moving pieces and variables to take into account as an event is about to happen, is happening for an evacuation. So as Dan mentioned, first responders, emergency management, you have the residents, vulnerable residents who might not be able to move as much. You have unhoused populations, tourists who might not know the area as well. So really taking into account all these different folks. And I think during an evacuation, it really takes everyone's involvement. And in terms of the industries, everyone has a role to play, whether it be planning or climate change mitigation. There's just so many aspects to this.
With that, just trying to understand, how has technology evolved in this landscape? Enrico, do you want to talk a bit about that technology and how it's changed?
Yeah, I think we are really at a turning point here when it comes to the technology that is available to aid wildfire evacuation planning and in general emergency management, because we have more and more simulation tools that can actually enable predictions of how these kind of threatening scenarios evolve, meaning that we can kind of see the future. And that's really fascinating because that helps us a lot in planning and managing these kind of emergencies. So the current tools that we see available, for instance, are trying to merge different layers through modeling and simulations that can play an important role. So for instance, both try to understand how the wildfire will spread and all the physical mechanisms of the fire, but also how the humans will respond based on the road network, their experience, who they are, what they do. So there is a lot of tools that factor in this kind of information and try to merge them in order to provide an informed support for decisions. And this is really what is happening in recent years with a lot of new tools that are based on VR, AI, and in general, everything that comes from simulations. I also want to bring up an interesting anecdote when it comes to the scale of the problem. 10 years ago, together with some colleagues that we do research in this space, we were thinking about imagining a simulation tool that could cope with 100,000 people evacuation. And back then, when we were talking to funding agencies, the feedback we were getting was that this was sci-fi, that this will never happen. And then a couple of years later, we have seen it with Fort McMurray, for instance, in Canada, where 88,000 people were evacuated, that what was sci-fi until a couple of years before it became reality. So, and as I said, with these tools, we can also predict what is not happened until now and plan for it. And this is very important when it comes to climate change and planning for climate change.
Okay, coming to the simulation, who is the user of these simulations? And I know we're going to talk about WUI-NITY, but before we do that, can we talk about what is WU? And am I pronouncing that right? Like, is it WU or is it
WUI?
WUI? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So what is WUI?
So WUI means wild and urban interface. So it's where the urban areas and the inhabited areas merge with vegetated areas. And that's the really critical parts, because generally if you have largely vegetated areas, there is not too many people living in there, which means that at least from the human safety perspective, it's not such complex scenarios to deal with a much smaller number of people. But in the WUI, what happened is that you have people living, and you may have many people living in this area. Sometimes we talk about thousands or tens of thousands of people living in those areas that are actually in direct contact with vegetation that can burn. And that's why basically you are facing these very challenging scenarios with people could potentially be trapped if you don't have a proper emergency planning and evacuation planning ahead of an emergency occurring.
As a planner, unfortunately, we are sprawling into that WUI area. And with that, as more people are moving into the WUI, there might be less local knowledge of what it means to live in the WUI. They've never lived there before. And so making sure that everyone is educated as well as all the planning that goes into that. And so I think that's why these tools are really helpful for us, especially as we keep growing and moving into those areas.
And so WUI isn't people induced then? Is it a moving line between like cities and natural land?
It's basically defined by the percentage of people that you have in relation to the vegetated areas. So in order to be considered a WUI area, you need to have a certain number of people in percentage and a certain number of vegetation, because it cannot be only vegetated area or it cannot be only urban area. And indeed, this kind of mix, this kind of interface between the vegetated areas and the populated areas, it's really what creates troubles when it comes to wildfires, because as I said, there are many, many challenges of trying to get out people from an endangered area where you are surrounded possibly by vegetation.
So I guess dystopian origin stories would start in the WUI area. Is that what we're saying?
That's unfortunately often the case because, as I said, people risk to get trapped.
In that instance, like when we're thinking about these like climate hotspots and trying to help people as like this line is moving, who needs to be informed or who needs to be involved in terms of better understanding the data in that community?
I may argue that everyone has to play a role in this. First of all, of course, the general public is the ultimate user of this information. But, the general public needs guidance, and that means that we need to have a few stakeholders involved, both at the planning stage, so companies and organizations that can support planning of those areas can play a very important role in understanding what could happen and dealing beforehand with the consequences of a wildfire. And on the other hand, of course, emergency responders, as we said, because they play a very important role along with municipalities on planning what to do with the community if something goes wrong, basically.
And we've seen different drivers. So you have, in some areas, policies and laws in place to require comprehensive planning for communities to say, given different scenarios, different hazards, what can your community do to make sure that they're prepared? And so there's that in place and funding mechanisms in place, as well as we've seen from bottom up, from the ground, folks who are interested in gathering up their community to plan these evacuation drills on their own. So it really can come from both sides. It'd be great to have more policies and laws in place and structure, but it's also great when we see some drills taking place, at least I've seen in America, drills in Colorado and Oregon that the community is starting because they're concerned for themselves or they've gone through unfortunate situations, so they want to be better prepared.
Where does technology really sit in this scenario? When you were thinking about this idea of let's create a tool that can support simulations for wildfire evacuations, how is that idea conceived and who is the user? I'd love to know more about who is using it and what are people doing with that information.
I can start describing how the idea behind the tool was conceived. And this goes back to a couple of years ago, maybe more than 10 years ago, when myself, that has been doing research in the evacuation space for many years, has had a chat with someone from Imperial College, Professor Rain, that has been working for years in understanding wildfire spread. And we were puzzled by the fact that we had systems and tools that were attempting modeling these two problems, but they were not talking to each other. And that's why we said, okay, now we need to sit down, we need to gather a pool of experts in different domains that can help us in developing such type of tools. And that's why also GHD came into the game, because we wanted to also understand potential users of those tools, what could do with them, and joining forces to try to have a tool that address all the key aspects that are affecting a wildfire evacuation. So that's how the general idea came, because as I said, a tool that just solved part of the problem is not what we really need. We need something that is able to address all the different aspects that play a role in a wildfire.
So who was involved in that product design? And also, Enrico, before I keep going, congratulations. Like I recently heard that you'd won an award for the specific tool.
Yeah, we're really proud because this is an award from the National Fire Protection Association in the US, which is basically the main regulator in the US when it comes to fire safety. And they have acknowledged the work that we have done with this foundation award. So it's really good news for us. But as I said, this effort started almost 10 years ago, and it involved Imperial College in London. We had colleagues from the National Research Council Canada, because of course it's a key driver in research on wildfire safety. We also had GHD involved and a few other partners, MIT in Australia, that we tried to get the right expertise on board from different parts of the world, and also to have that kind of perspective that we could not just do a tool that was by researchers for researchers, but we want to make it something useful for end users like GHD. So someone that can take this type of tool and make it into an actionable tool for designing against wildfire or planning for wildfire evacuation emergencies.
Dan, do you use this like frequently in their projects? Like when do you use it? How is it improving the role for evacuation?
So Kamryn and I are those kind of users, and we're working in that loop with Enrico's team and the researchers to provide that kind of industry feedback of the tools and the features that we want to have in WUI-NITY. And obviously, as Enrico mentioned, they are incredibly complex systems with challenging in size and scale and fast evolving. And sometimes those complex systems make it difficult to derive possible outcomes. So using WUI-NITY as planners or for emergency responders, or indeed for the community, it gives you the ability, when you're considering emergency response and evacuation, to assess and compare options. And then when you're kind of modeling that or doing those tabletops and discussing it, you identify those vulnerabilities that you may not have even kind of thought about before. So we're using it in 2 or 3 different ways. One in the planning phase. So that's if we're kind of assessing the impact of those potential land zone changes, or as we mentioned earlier, that increase in population in the WUI itself. So we can assess the impact for that, both under the current infrastructure. So can that new development be accommodated in that infrastructure? Or do we need to look at assessing capital infrastructure projects? So what would the impact be if we were to evacuate with the roads that we have today, or the roads that we might have tomorrow, if we're going to have to need to widen that or to add in a new road, for example? And then the second use that we've got is for sensitivity, so that we can have a robust plan in place. What happens if we were to lose an escape as a result of the wildfire expanding to the south, for example, and we can only evacuate to the north? And what's the impact of if we were to have those new refuge areas, or changes in population behavior? For example, response times, if this was to happen at night versus in the middle of the day, would that change how people are moving around and the traffic patterns that we have as a result of that?
Are you simulating like new developments as well? We know that urban sprawl is another thing that's really contributing to growth all over the world. It's also impacting climate change. But coming to this topic, how is this tool helping with these other factors, like these externalities that are really a reality of evacuation in general?
Yeah, so we might see a community in Northern California, for example, that's looking to put a new development in part of that kind of unbuilt WUI area, that Greenland. And then what's the impact of the population in that area increasing by 20% when they don't change the infrastructure? How long does it take people to escape under the same conditions? And then we can run the exact same test with that population uplift and see how much longer it's taking for people to reach those refuge areas. So we're able to clearly compare and contrast those available options while keeping some of the variables constant, which is good for being able to compare the impact that one change is having, which is something that you don't get the beauty of having in real life.
One of the interesting things about WUI-NITY is that it can model pedestrian movement, traffic movement, as well as wildfire spread. So as Dan is talking about all these different scenarios, this is what WUI-NITY can do to help us really estimate, the timing, what's going to happen, where are we seeing congestion, and planning for getting a community out with different evacuation routes. As Dan is saying, with the communities that are being built out, do they have enough ways to get out?
Now that you've collected the data, you've done all the simulations, who implements it? Are you giving it to planners? Like, how is it tangible for that everyday person in a community?
So our projects that we've been using right now are going towards the jurisdictions, the cities, the counties that can use this information for their planning documents, their comprehensive planning. That's just one way, but also the community can take this information and help them for even practicing future drills or seeing what they need to do and maybe advocate on their end as well.
Got it. And so, Enrico, if you were in a community and you saw an evacuation plan or a plan that's being put in place in front of a community, could you say, oh, this is coming from this specific simulation?
Well, I have a very interesting case because recently, and Kamryn was involved as well, we were actually asked by a community in Colorado to go there and observe an evacuation drill, and we asked them back to collect data, and that was useful to inform perform simulations and help us calibrating our models. And it was really encouraging for people like us that we work with simulations to see to which extent the simulations that we produce are in line with what happened in the real world. Because one of the key challenges of developing simulators is that you can be the best computer scientist in the world, or you can be the best mathematician in the world. But if you want to have something that is usable and actionable, you need to be able to represent the real world. So a common effort by researchers like us is try to systematically compare what you will get from a simulator with real life behavior and real world events. So, and as you can imagine, it's much easier for us to collect such type of data during evacuation drills because we know this beforehand than during an event. Although a lot of the work that we have been doing in developing and testing our model is also based, for instance, of traffic data from real events, because fortunately there are many places around the world which have are very generous in sharing data, for instance, that they get from traffic measurements and so on. So, for instance, the California Department of Transportation share pretty much all the information publicly about the traffic on the roads, even during wildfires, which means that we could actually source those data and systematically use them to develop and test WUI-NITY. But as mentioned, it's an important aspect to highlight. Every tool, it will be as good as the data that are used to calibrate the tool. And one of the huge efforts that we are keep putting in WUI-NITY is to try to increase more and more the pool of data that feed into the tool in order to be able to account for a wide variety of scenarios. Because, as I said, simulating a rural or WUI community, a smaller community, it's not the same thing of simulating 100,000 people evacuation. But our tool is meant to be able to reproduce both of these kind of extreme scenarios.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because as a person that studied economics, I always struggled with that. Like every model that you build up has like 10 million assumptions to it. Most of the time it's not realistic. So it's really nice to hear that you're actually building something that has like a realistic implication and people can go out and plan it, and you've tested it with a couple of different municipalities.
It's not the only tool that you use to plan for these responses, and it's only can be used as a suite of tools to supplement the planning and evacuation performance. So we have to think about how we can engage with the community from the outset to make sure that we're preventing these incidents in the first place. But if they do occur, to make sure that we have sufficiently engaged with them to ensure that individuals, especially those that are most vulnerable, are prepared to evacuate in a timely manner. So we know what the model might say, but we need to make sure that people actually are ready and waiting to be able to be evacuated as and when those events arise.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, which is around stakeholder engagement. So now you have like all this data and it's being shared with the planners, but for communities at risk where they might not have the same amount of resources, have you seen these municipalities act and support various types of communities and build out stakeholder engagement plans? Are you involved in that process as well?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the kind of relationship between industry and researchers that Enrico mentioned. And that's actually led to a new development within WUI-NITY, WUI-NITY Show, or WUI Show even, where you can actually be able to put these outputs onto tabletops, desktops, and be able to kind of zoom in and see where people are at each time as part of that evacuation. And that's just a really important method of being able to engage people, to be able to see that work is being done to address this important issue, but also to give them a kind of feel of what it's going to look like and where those emergencies and high risk points may be. So kind of visualizing those outputs in a way that can be easily understood by the community is a great development and add-on.
Yeah, because to add on this, if we would just plug out a bunch of numbers, yes, maybe to a fire engineer could be useful, but for a general public or even stakeholders that are not necessarily used to work with the simulation tools may not be as easily accessible. So the most recent work that we have been put has been placed on trying to visualize outputs in a way that could be easily digested, let's say, by everyone, and also in an interactive way so that you could basically see the evolution of the wildfire evacuation, hypothetical wildfire evacuation scenarios, and then take decisions based on what you see or inform population based on what you see.
Do you ever go into the world of augmented reality, virtual reality, or any other technologies to kind of help with that? What's the experience that you're building out?
Yeah, the name WUI-NITY actually comes from the tool that we use behind the scene to develop the simulator is Unity, that is one of the most known game engines. Just for explaining what a game engine is what you see behind the scene when you develop a video game. This is exactly the world where we come from, where we have basically natively a tool that is designed to work, for instance, in VR, so that in the not so far future, we will not just have a visualization on the screen on what is happening, but you should be able also to wear a head-mounted display, for instance, and living in first person how it will look like if your house is burning. So that's the idea down the road. And those things until a couple of years ago, again, looked like sci-fi dystopian future. Now we're getting closer and closer to actually have something like this that is not just a game, but it's actually based on the physics, on the real world data. So not just a fictitious representation of what will happen, but based on real science behind what will actually happen. So that's the direction where we are going, especially with VR, mixed reality, to have tools that can be directly used to have a first-hand experience of what will look like to live a wildfire.
Yeah, as a designer and an innovation lead, I always believe that experiences are like the best way for somebody to go and test out strategies. So whether it's visualization, gamification, or, different ways to make something more tangible, I think it just helps with like what are some of the flaws that could happen if you were to design, for example, an evacuation plan. So it's awesome to hear that you have poached a bunch of game designers to develop something that's actually very meaningful and can mitigate or at least adapt to climate change as it's more of a reality.
The way I see it, this is much bigger than regular building fire safety engineering, because the scale of the problem, the financial aspects involved in destruction from wildfires is much larger. And the first ones that will be, let's say, aggressively pulling themselves into the market systematically, they will get a big share of it. And we are now in that transition point where the technology is arriving there on the market and it started being used concretely.
Yeah, it's really an iterative process, as planners, working with the developers like Enrico, and then engaging with the community. And so what we've seen in Colorado, we worked with them in 2019. They did an evacuation drill. We also collected data for the tool, provided their feedback on how it went, what could go better. And then they did another drill actually last year. So we're kind of working with the communities, engaging with them that way to inform the tool. And then as planners, we're going back to the developers as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know we talked a lot about climate adaptation. Like at the end of the day, some of the simulations that we're developing, they are to adapt to climate change. Do you also use technologies to help with climate mitigation?
I see that the technology in the kind of evacuation space is obviously on the planning side, but we can increasingly see ourselves using it for the kind of identification, prediction and forecasting of where these wildfires are going to be. So the earlier that we can find out where they are starting and where they are moving to, gives us that kind of early warning system that we can able to either put it out as quick as we can before it gets too large, or that we have as much time to evacuate people from those areas as we can. So we're starting to see quite a lot of technological improvements on the identification of those fires and those potential severities and where they are forecasted to move to. And obviously that has it's not a mitigation, but it's an adaptation that we're having to find as more people are moving into the WUI. And we're also seeing technological improvements around communication as well. So the ability to get the messaging out there quicker and via different methods than we had previously seen. And obviously the more people that find out about it earlier, the shorter the response time, the quicker that we can get those communities evacuated.
Got it. What is the future of wildfire evacuation and using these simulations, or the future of just using these simulations overall?
I'm just really excited for using these tools and really the integration of these tools as we've been talking about. So having WUI-NITY, having AI, and seeing how we integrate these tools. And as we collect more data, it's only going to get better. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah, I think the pervasiveness of this is not going to go away. So I guess in terms of the future of where evacuation modelling for communities is going to go, unfortunately, it's going to impact more people. But hopefully through these tools and the pervasiveness of these tools and through standards and guidance, it becomes much more of a streamlined approach of which communities from the bottom up and from the top down, from those provinces and those states, can start to mean that we get those responses quicker and more efficient to impact those communities.
To me, the main key take-home message is that we are now at a turning point. And what was happening maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago when we were designing fire safety in buildings is now happening in wildfires at a community scale. We will soon reach a point in which when you want to build a community, when you want to plan new developments, you will have to do an engineering analysis for wildfire evacuation in the same way you would have done it at the building scale if you're planning a new hospital or a new facility. And this will have a huge set of implications on the market because, as I said, the scale of the problem is much larger. And I don't talk about twice as large. I talk about 10, 100, 1,000 times as large as what we have when we talk about designing for fire safety in buildings.
You've been listening to Transform, Tomorrow's Thinking Today, a podcast for GHD produced by Sound Cartel. Follow Transform free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.